The new VP called my safety protocols expensive fluff. He fired me to save $50,000 a year. I packed my desk silently. 3 weeks later, the FAA grounded the entire fleet indefinitely. He called me begging for the compliance codes. I replied, "Sorry, I'm just expensive fluff." So the new VP decided my 11 years of keeping planes in the sky was expensive fluff and fired me to save 50 grand annually. 3 weeks later, the FAA grounded every aircraft in the fleet. He called me crying about compliance codes. I told him I was just expensive fluff and hung up. Buckle in because this one's a ride. I'm Nathan, 34 male, and I spent 11 years as the safety compliance manager for Ridgeline Regional Airlines. Small operation based out of Colorado. 37 aircraft, 12 routes across the Mountain West and into California. Nothing glamorous, just dependable regional service moving people between mid-sized cities that the major carriers couldn't be bothered with. When I started there in 2013, Ridgeline was a disaster waiting to happen. Previous compliance guy had retired and left behind a filing system that looked like a tornado hit a Staples. FAA inspection reports scattered across 3 different databases. Maintenance documentation that contradicted itself depending on which folder you opened. I spent my first 2 years rebuilding everything from scratch, created a unified compliance tracking system, digitized 11 years of maintenance records, developed inspection checklists that actually matched FAA requirements, built relationships with FAA regional inspectors so they knew exactly what to expect when they showed up. The work wasn't exciting. It was methodical, precise. Every bolt logged, every inspection documented, every maintenance action recorded with timestamps and technician signatures. By year 3, Ridgeline went from barely passing inspections to becoming a model operation. FAA started sending other regional carriers to observe our compliance processes. I testified twice at industry safety conferences about documentation best practices. Trade publications wrote about our transformation. Our insurance premiums dropped by 18% because our safety record was that clean. Year 5 brought the real test. An engine nacelle inspection revealed a potential fatigue crack on one of our older aircraft. I coordinated with the FAA, our maintenance team, and the aircraft manufacturer to develop an inspection protocol for every similar aircraft. Documented everything. Kept regulators informed. What could have been a crisis became a case study in proactive safety management. The FAA regional director sent me a personal letter afterward, framed it, hung it on my office wall. Exemplary compliance practices that should serve as a model for the regional aviation industry. The owner, Harold Ostrowski, was an old-school aviation guy. Former pilot who'd started Ridgeline in 1987 with 2 aircraft and a prayer. Understood that safety compliance wasn't a cost center. It was the thing that kept the whole operation from getting shut down overnight. Every quarter, Harold would pull me into his office, review the compliance metrics, shake my hand, and tell me I was the reason he could sleep at night. Then Harold had his heart attack. Happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Collapsed on the tarmac during his morning walk. Maintenance crew called emergency services. Got him to the hospital in time. He survived, but the doctors were clear. Flying days were over. Running an airline was over too. His heart couldn't take the stress anymore. His kids weren't interested in the business. One was a dentist in Seattle. The other did something with real estate in Arizona. They wanted cash, not aircraft. By June, Ridgeline had been sold to Evergreen Aviation Holdings, private equity group out of Denver that specialized in acquiring regional carriers. Their pitch was operational efficiency and strategic consolidation. What that actually meant was cutting costs wherever possible and squeezing margins until something broke. The new corporate overlord sent a transition team in July. Spent 3 weeks reviewing every department. Asked a lot of questions about headcount and overhead. Wanted justification for every expense over a certain threshold. They asked very few questions about safety records, almost nothing about compliance history. Just wanted numbers, costs, margins. That should have been my first warning sign. August brought the new vice president of operations, guy named Bradley Ashworth, mid-40s, expensive suits, MBA from some school he mentioned constantly. He'd spent his career in hospitality and retail before somehow landing an aviation operations role. No aviation background, no regulatory experience. First week, Bradley walked the facility like he was inspecting a hotel, made comments about office layouts, questioned the coffee budget, asked why maintenance techs needed such large tool allowances. Bradley scheduled one-on-ones with every department head. Mine was on Thursday at 2 p.m. I showed up with a compliance overview binder, 63 pages covering our entire safety management system, inspection schedules, and documentation protocols. Bradley glanced at the binder, didn't open it, just pushed it aside and leaned back with that look executives get when they think they're about to teach you something important. "Nathan, I've been reviewing departmental budgets. Your area has some interesting numbers. I nodded. Compliance overhead runs about $285,000 annually when you factor in my salary, documentation specialist, software subscriptions, and third-party audit fees. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. He pulled up a spreadsheet. Previous ownership seemed to have a very generous interpretation of what compliance requires. I think we can streamline significantly. I kept my face neutral. Streamline how? Well, for starters, do we really need a full-time compliance manager? Most of our competitors outsource this function. Most of our competitors have had aircraft grounded by the FAA in the last 5 years. We haven't. He waved his hand. That's fear-based thinking. The aviation industry has matured. Regulations are standardized. We don't need someone sitting here full-time worrying about paperwork. The paperwork is what proves to federal regulators that our aircraft are safe to carry passengers. Without proper documentation, the FAA can ground planes on the spot. Bradley smiled. That patronizing kind that people use when they think they're smarter than you. I understand you're protective of your position, but Evergreen has acquired 6 regional carriers. We know how to optimize operations without compromising safety. I wanted to point out that we've done this before wasn't the same as we've done this successfully, but I'd learned that arguing with people who'd already made up their minds was a waste of energy. So I just asked if there was anything specific he wanted me to prepare. Actually, yes. His eyes lit up. I need a complete inventory of every compliance function you perform. Every task, every hour spent, every dollar allocated. I want to see where the fat is. Want to understand what's essential versus what's habit. I'll have it to you by Monday. That weekend, I built the most comprehensive breakdown of my job I'd ever created. Every inspection coordination, every documentation update, every FAA communication, every maintenance record review, every safety protocol audit, every vendor verification, every insurance report, every system configuration, every emergency procedure test, 412 distinct tasks across a typical month. Some daily, some weekly, some quarterly, some annual, all interconnected, all required by either federal regulation, insurance policy, or operational necessity. I cross-referenced every task to the specific FAA regulation or insurance requirement that mandated it, showed the consequences of non-compliance for each category. Monday morning, I dropped the report on Bradley's desk. 94 pages with appendices. He looked at the stack of paper. This is extensive. You asked for a complete inventory. That's complete. Everything I do, why I do it, and what happens if I don't do it. The regulatory references are in the margin. He flipped through a few pages without reading them. Said he'd review it this week. He didn't read it. I know because I embedded a small notation on page 47 asking him to initial if he'd reviewed that section. A simple test to see if anyone actually engaged with the material. That page came back unsigned 3 months later when HR returned my materials after the termination. For the next 6 weeks, Bradley kept pushing. Every conversation circled back to cost reduction. Wanted to know why we needed monthly maintenance documentation audits when quarterly would be cheaper. Wanted to understand why I personally coordinated with FAA inspectors instead of letting maintenance handle it. Asked why we couldn't just use standard software instead of my customized tracking system. Wanted justification for every software subscription, every filing system, every process I'd built over 11 years. I answered every question professionally. Provided documentation, cited regulations, explained consequences, drew diagrams when verbal explanations didn't seem to register, offered to walk him through actual inspection scenarios so he could see how the documentation requirements worked in practice. None of it mattered. Bradley had already decided that compliance was overhead, not infrastructure. He just needed enough ammunition to justify the cut. My detailed explanations weren't changing his mind. They were just giving him material to argue against. October brought the quarterly budget review. Bradley presented his optimization plan to the Evergreen executive team via video conference. I wasn't invited to that meeting, but Sandra from HR told me afterward what happened. Bradley had proposed eliminating my position entirely, outsourcing compliance to a consulting firm that would handle documentation quarterly for about $80,000 annually. Additional maintenance staff would absorb the daily documentation tasks. Net savings of roughly $50,000 when you factored in my salary and benefits versus consulting fees and additional maintenance hours. The CFO asked about risk. Bradley said the risk was minimal because aviation compliance was standardized and predictable. Modern software automated most of the tracking. The consulting firm had FAA experience. Everything would be fine. The CEO asked if anyone on the maintenance team could handle day-to-day documentation. Bradley said he'd already discussed it with the maintenance director, and they were confident they could absorb the basic functions. Just needed some training during the transition period. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody reviewed my 94-page report. Nobody contacted the FAA regional office to understand what proper compliance actually required. Nobody talked to our insurance carrier about documentation requirements. They just saw a line item they could cut and decided that was enough information to make the call. November 4th, Tuesday morning. Bradley called me to his office at 9 a.m. HR representative, already sitting there when I walked in. That's the universal signal that something bad is about to happen. Nathan, we've made some organizational changes. Bradley's voice had that rehearsed quality executives get when they've practiced delivering bad news. Efficient, but artificial. We're transitioning compliance functions to an outsourced model. Your position is being eliminated effective November 18th. I just sat there for a second. Processing. 11 years, 412 monthly tasks, 0 FAA violations in over a decade. The framed letter from the FAA regional director. All of it dismissed because a guy with an MBA decided compliance was expensive fluff. The HR rep slid a folder across the desk. Separation agreement, standard severance. 2 weeks pay plus accrued vacation. Sign here, here, and initial here. I didn't touch the folder. What happens to the compliance documentation system? Bradley shifted in his chair like the question surprised him. Maintenance will handle ongoing documentation. Wallace has already been briefed on the transition. The consulting firm will conduct quarterly audits to verify everything's in order. The FAA requires real-time documentation updates for certain maintenance activities. Quarterly audits won't catch discrepancies until they've already become violations. That's why we have the consulting firm on retainer. Bradley's voice got a little defensive. They can address issues as needed. Come in on short notice if something urgent comes up. They can't address issues they don't know about. That's the whole point of continuous compliance monitoring. By the time a quarterly audit catches something, you've potentially got months of accumulated problems. Bradley's jaw tightened. This decision has been made at the executive level. We're not here to debate it. I looked at the HR rep. She avoided eye contact, stared at the folder like it contained the secrets of the universe. Didn't want any part of this conversation. Fine. I stood up. I'll need until end of day Friday to properly transition documentation access. Walk Wallace through the system basics. Make sure he knows where everything is. That's reasonable. Bradley looked relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. The maintenance director will coordinate with you on handoff procedures. I walked out. Didn't shake anyone's hand. Didn't thank anyone for the opportunity. Didn't say anything about how much I'd enjoyed working there or how I wished them well. Just walked back to my desk and started planning. Here's the thing about compliance work. Everything is interconnected. The inspection schedules depend on the maintenance records. The maintenance records depend on the parts tracking system. The parts tracking system depends on the vendor documentation protocols. The vendor protocols depend on the purchase order system. Pull one thread, and the whole thing starts to unravel. I spent that week doing exactly what they asked, transitioning documentation access, creating handoff guides, walking the maintenance director through the compliance tracking system, showing him where the files were stored and how the database is connected. What I didn't do was make any of it easy. Every system I'd built over 11 years had my institutional knowledge baked into it. The compliance tracking database had custom fields that only made sense if you understood FAA inspection cycles and how regional inspectors actually requested information. The documentation filing structure followed a logic I developed based on years of experience with what worked and what didn't. The vendor management protocols included relationship notes that explained why certain suppliers required different handling based on past interactions. None of this was written down anywhere obvious. It lived in my head, in the way I'd configured systems, in the shortcuts and workarounds I'd developed through a decade of experience, in the understanding of what regulators actually cared about versus what the formal requirements technically said. I gave them access to everything, every file, every system, every database, every protocol document. What I didn't give them was context. They got the ingredients, but not the recipe, the parts, but not the assembly instructions. Technically, I fulfilled my transition obligations completely. Practically, I handed them a car with the keys in the ignition, but no manual for how to drive it. Friday afternoon, I packed my desk. 11 years fit into 2 cardboard boxes, photos of aircraft I'd helped keep in the sky, a few plaques from safety conferences, the framed letter from the FAA regional director, personal items that had accumulated over a decade of keeping passengers safe while they flew 30,000 feet above the ground. Bradley walked by as I was carrying boxes to my car in the parking lot, actually stopped and tried to shake my hand like we were parting on good terms. No hard feelings, Nathan. This is just business. I'm sure you'll land somewhere great. I looked at his hand. Didn't take it. You should check the maintenance documentation protocols before next month's inspection cycle. The FAA is particularly thorough in Q4. They like to close out the year with comprehensive reviews. I'm sure the consulting firm will handle it. He dropped his hand, still smiling, confident in his cost-cutting triumph. Sure. I loaded the boxes in my trunk. Good luck. Drove home. That night, I updated my resume and started reaching out to contacts in the industry. Aviation compliance is a small world. Word travels fast among people who do this work. By Monday, I had 3 phone interviews scheduled with other regional carriers who'd heard I was available. What happened over the next 3 weeks, I only learned about later. Pieced it together from Sandra in HR, who kept me updated via text messages, from a maintenance tech named Eddie, who I'd worked with for 8 years and who was furious about my termination, from industry contacts who heard rumors, from public records once things got bad enough to make the news. Eddie made it his personal mission to document the collapse, sent me updates almost daily, screenshots of system errors, photos of confused paperwork, quotes from conversations he'd overheard. The whole slow-motion disaster playing out in real time. Week 1 was the honeymoon period. Bradley held a department meeting to announce the new streamlined compliance structure. Maintenance would handle daily documentation. The consulting firm would audit quarterly. Everything would be more efficient, leaner, modern. Wallace, the maintenance director who'd been with Ridgeline for 8 years, immediately discovered that my compliance tracking system was more complex than he'd expected. The custom fields didn't match the standard reporting formats he was familiar with from his maintenance background. The cross-references between databases didn't make intuitive sense unless you understood why I'd set them up that way. He spent 3 days just trying to figure out how to generate the weekly inspection summary report. A report that took me 15 minutes every Monday morning took him most of the week to reconstruct. Bradley told him to figure it out faster. Wallace called the consulting firm asking for emergency guidance. They said they'd send someone during the next scheduled quarterly audit in January. That was their contract. Quarterly audits. Anything beyond that would be additional charges. Bradley didn't want to pay additional charges. Told Wallace to use Google and the system documentation. Week 2 brought the first actual problem. An FAA inspector showed up for a routine ramp check at our Denver hub. Standard procedure that happens regularly at any commercial aviation operation. They pick a random aircraft, inspect its physical condition, and review the documentation to verify that maintenance records match what they're seeing. The inspector requested the maintenance log for aircraft N447RG. Specifically wanted to see the last 3 inspection cycles with parts replacement documentation. Basic request. The kind of thing I could have pulled up in about 30 seconds. Wallace couldn't find it. Not because it didn't exist, but because my filing system used a cross-reference structure that linked maintenance logs to inspection cycles to parts inventory. Without understanding that structure, he was searching in the wrong place. Looking in the maintenance database when the documentation was actually in the inspection archive with a cross-reference link. The inspector waited 45 minutes, then an hour, then started asking questions about why basic documentation was taking so long to locate. Wallace finally called Eddie in to help. Eddie found the file in 20 minutes because he'd seen me pull similar documentation before and remembered approximately where it lived. But the damage was done. The inspector wrote up a documentation discrepancy finding. Not a violation technically, but a formal notice that documentation wasn't being maintained according to requirements. A flag on the record that would trigger enhanced scrutiny on future inspections. Bradley told Wallace to fix it before it became a bigger problem. Wallace worked until midnight reconstructing the documentation trail. Found everything eventually, got the inspector to note that the records were complete, just disorganized. But the FAA now had a flag on Ridgeline's record. First crack in the foundation. Week 3 was when things got really interesting. The quarterly insurance audit happened. Our aviation liability carrier sent their risk assessment team to review safety documentation. This was routine. Happened every quarter. I'd always prepared a comprehensive compliance package that made the audit take about 2 hours. Pre-organized everything they typically asked for. Anticipated questions. Had supporting documentation ready. Without that package, the auditors had to dig through raw files themselves. Search databases they weren't familiar with. Request documentation that wasn't immediately available. The audit that usually took 2 hours took 2 days. They found inconsistencies. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough gaps in documentation that they flagged Ridgeline for enhanced monitoring. Our insurance premiums were going up by 12% unless we could demonstrate improved compliance within 60 days. Additional documentation requirements? Monthly reporting instead of quarterly. Bradley blamed Wallace. Wallace blamed the consulting firm for not being available. The consulting firm blamed the transition process and noted that their contract was for quarterly audits, not continuous support. Nobody blamed the decision to eliminate the person who'd kept everything running smoothly for 11 years. Then came the maintenance log issue. Every aircraft requires continuous maintenance documentation. Every part replaced, every inspection performed, every discrepancy noted and resolved. The FAA requires this documentation to be complete, accurate, and current. Gaps in maintenance logs can ground an aircraft until the paperwork is verified. Extended gaps can trigger fleet-wide reviews. My system automatically flagged when documentation was incomplete. Little alerts that would pop up if a maintenance action hadn't been properly recorded within 24 hours. I'd configured those alerts to go to my email address so I could follow up immediately with the maintenance, my email that no longer existed. The alerts were still generating. They were just going nowhere, bouncing to a defunct mailbox that nobody was monitoring. For 3 weeks, documentation gaps accumulated without anyone noticing. Maintenance techs were doing their jobs. The physical work was getting done, but the paperwork wasn't getting filed properly because nobody was watching the system that tracked it. By the end of week 3, 7 aircraft had incomplete maintenance documentation, not unsafe aircraft. The maintenance work had been performed correctly, but aircraft where the paperwork didn't match the work performed. And in aviation, paperwork is everything. Without proper documentation, you can't prove the work was done. And if you can't prove the work was done, the aircraft isn't legally airworthy. December 2nd, Monday morning. The FAA regional office called Ridgeline to schedule a comprehensive compliance audit. This wasn't routine. This was triggered by the documentation discrepancy finding from week 2, combined with a tip they'd received about potential maintenance record irregularities. Found out later that tip came from a former Ridgeline pilot who'd heard rumors about the compliance situation through industry contacts and decided to report his concerns to regulators. The audit was scheduled for December 9th, 1 week away. Comprehensive review of all compliance systems, documentation practices, and safety management protocols. Bradley finally panicked, called the consulting firm demanding they send someone immediately, emergency support, whatever it took. The consulting firm said their next available auditor was December 15th, 6 days after the FAA audit. They offered to send someone sooner for a substantial emergency fee, triple their normal hourly rate. Bradley authorized the expense. Consultant arrived December 5th. Spent 3 days trying to understand a system they'd never seen before, built by someone they'd never met, configured for requirements they weren't familiar with. By December 8th, the consultant told Bradley they couldn't guarantee the documentation would be ready for the FAA audit. Too many gaps, too little time, too much complexity in the system architecture. Bradley called Wallace and told him to fix everything overnight. Wallace said that was impossible, without understanding how the compliance system worked. Every fix he attempted seemed to break something else, because he didn't understand the cross-references. Bradley told him to figure it out or find a new job. Wallace called me that night. First time we'd spoken since I left. His voice was shaking. "Nathan, I need help. Desperately." "With what?" "Everything. The documentation system, the inspection protocols, the FAA audit tomorrow. I don't know how any of this works, and Bradley's threatening to fire me if I can't sort it out overnight." I listened, let him talk, heard the stress in his voice. The desperation of someone drowning in a system they didn't understand, the fear of someone whose career was about to be destroyed by decisions they didn't make. Part of me felt bad for Wallace. He was a good maintenance director, knew aircraft inside and out, but compliance wasn't his expertise, and Bradley had thrown him into the deep end without a life jacket. Part of me remembered Bradley calling my work expensive fluff, remembered 11 years dismissed as fat to be trimmed, remembered the handshake I didn't take. "Wallace, I'm not employed by Ridgeline anymore. I don't have access to the systems. I don't have authorization to modify documentation. I'm not legally allowed to represent the company to regulators. I know. I'm asking as a favor. Please, just tell me what to do. Walk me through it over the phone." I thought about it. Thought about the passengers who flew on those aircraft every day. Regular people trusting that someone was paying attention to the details that kept them safe. Thought about the maintenance techs who'd lose their jobs if the airline went under. Good people who had nothing to do with Bradley's decisions. Then I thought about how those decisions were made. The executive meeting I wasn't invited to. The 94-page report nobody read. The assumption that my expertise was expendable. I can't help you for free. And I can't help you on a timeline that makes Bradley look good. If Ridgeline wants my expertise, they can hire me as a consultant. Market rate, $275 per hour. 60-day minimum engagement. Direct reporting to Evergreen corporate leadership, not to Bradley. And I need a written acknowledgement that my termination was a business decision that did not reflect on my professional performance. Wallace was quiet for a long moment. He's never going to agree to that. Not with the audit tomorrow. Then I guess you'd better start reading the 94-page report I left. Everything you need is in there. Page references to every system, every protocol, every cross-reference. Nathan, please. I have a family. If this goes bad, I'm going to lose everything. I understand. And I'm sorry you're in this position. But I'm not the one who put you there. Bradley did. Take it up with him. I hung up. Went back to watching TV. Didn't feel bad about it. Shouldn't have to feel bad about protecting myself from people who discarded me without a second thought. December 9th arrived. The FAA audit team showed up at 8 a.m. 3 inspectors, comprehensive document review, aircraft inspection, interviews with compliance personnel. They found problems. 7 aircraft with incomplete maintenance documentation gaps ranging from 3 days to 3 weeks. 2 aircraft with inspection discrepancies that hadn't been properly resolved and logged. 1 aircraft with a parts replacement that wasn't logged correctly in the tracking system. The compliance tracking system hadn't been properly updated in 3 weeks. Alert emails were bouncing to a non-existent address. The quarterly audit preparation package didn't exist because I'd always created it manually based on institutional knowledge. Wallace tried to explain. Transition period. New processes being implemented. Previous compliance manager had left recently. The lead inspector wasn't sympathetic. Your transition period created compliance gaps. Compliance gaps create safety risks. Safety risks ground aircraft. That's how federal aviation regulation works. We don't make exceptions because you're reorganizing. By 2 p.m., the lead inspector had seen enough. She called Bradley into the conference room and delivered the news formally. Ridgeline Regional Airlines was being placed under enhanced surveillance. Effective immediately, all aircraft with documentation discrepancies were grounded until paperwork could be verified and corrected. That was 9 aircraft, almost a quarter of the fleet. Additionally, the FAA was requiring a complete compliance system audit within 30 days. If Ridgeline couldn't demonstrate proper safety management protocols meeting federal requirements, the entire operation would be reviewed for continued certification. Bradley tried to explain. Transition period. New consulting relationship being established. Temporary adjustment phase that would be resolved quickly. The inspector cut him off. Mr. Ashworth, I've been doing this for 22 years. I've seen every excuse in the book. Your explanations don't change your compliance status. Get your documentation in order, or this situation is going to get worse. By December 11th, the grounding had expanded. More documentation issues were discovered as Wallace and the consultant tried to reconstruct records. 12 aircraft total now sitting on the ground. Flight schedules were being canceled. Passengers were being rebooked on competitor carriers at Ridgeline's expense. Revenue was hemorrhaging. Eddie sent me photos of the grounded aircraft sitting on the tarmac. 12 planes with red tags on their doors. Millions of dollars in assets that couldn't generate revenue because the paperwork didn't exist to prove they were safe. December 13th, Friday afternoon. My phone rang. Unknown number, but Colorado area code. Nathan, this is Bradley Ashworth. I waited. Didn't say anything. Let him fill the silence. I think we got off on the wrong foot. His voice was different now. Strained. Humble in a way that sounded physically painful for someone with his ego. Ridgeline needs your expertise. We'd like to bring you back as a consultant to help resolve our current situation. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Let him sit in the discomfort of waiting for my response. What situation would that be? The FAA has grounded a portion of our fleet pending documentation verification. We need someone who understands the compliance system to help us get back to operational status. Quickly. I thought my compliance system was expensive fluff. That's what you called it, right? Expensive fluff that could be replaced with quarterly consulting and some extra maintenance hours? More silence. I could hear him breathing, probably grinding his teeth, probably wondering how his cost-cutting triumph had turned into this disaster. I may have underestimated the complexity of your role. May have? Long pause. Look, I'm willing to admit I made a mistake. Can we move forward? Work together to solve this problem? Sure. My consulting rate is $275 per hour, with a minimum 40-hour weekly commitment. 60-day engagement minimum. I require direct reporting authority to Evergreen corporate leadership, not to you. And I need a written acknowledgement that my termination was a business decision that did not reflect negatively on my professional performance. That's not reasonable. Bradley's voice cracked. We can't afford that kind of expense right now. Not with 12 aircraft grounded and revenue down 40% this week. Really? I leaned back in my chair. Because 3 weeks ago, you told me that eliminating my position would save $50,000 annually. Seems like a reasonable investment to get a $12 million fleet back in the air. The FAA is being unreasonable. This is a paperwork issue, not a safety issue. The aircraft are perfectly safe. Tell that to the federal regulators who grounded them. Tell that to the passengers who can't fly because your aircraft don't have proper documentation. Tell that to the investors who are watching revenue disappear. Tell that to your insurance carrier who's probably already drafting premium increase letters. I'm not the bad guy here, Nathan. Bradley's voice got defensive. I was trying to optimize operations, make the company more efficient. That's my job. Your job created this situation. You eliminated institutional knowledge to save $50,000, and it's going to cost you millions in grounded aircraft, lost revenue, insurance increases, and regulatory penalties. That's not optimization. That's negligence. He tried a different approach. Nathan, I'm asking you to help people. The employees who are going to lose their jobs if this company fails. The passengers who depend on our service. This isn't about me. It's about them. Then you shouldn't have made decisions that put them at risk. I let that sit for a second. My terms are what they are. Take them or figure it out without me. I hear the consulting firm has someone available now. Maybe they can sort it out with enough time and money. We've already spent $40,000 on emergency consulting fees, and they couldn't fix the system. That's because they don't understand the system. I built it. I configured it. I know how it works. That knowledge has value. If you want it, you pay for it. Long silence. When Bradley spoke again, his voice was flat, defeated. I need to take this to corporate. This is beyond my authorization. Do what you need to do. You have my number. I hung up, sat there for a minute, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not vindictive satisfaction exactly, more like validation. The recognition that expertise matters, that 11 years of careful, methodical work actually meant something. December 16th, Monday morning. Different phone call. Not Bradley this time. Nathan, this is Franklin Wells, CEO of Evergreen Aviation Holdings. I straightened up in my chair. Mr. Wells, what can I do for you? You can accept my apology, for starters. His voice was direct, professional, the kind of tone that suggested he didn't waste time on pleasantry. I've been reviewing the situation at Ridgeline in detail. I've read your 94-page compliance report. I've spoken with the FAA regional office. I've talked to Wallace and the consulting firm and several members of the maintenance team. I understand now what happened and why. I'm listening. We made a mistake. Bradley made a mistake. I made a mistake by not scrutinizing his recommendations more carefully. We eliminated a critical function without understanding what it did or why it mattered. The compliance system you built was sophisticated, effective, and apparently irreplaceable on short notice. We didn't appreciate that until it was too late. Okay, I'd like to offer you a position, not as a consultant, not temporary, as Regional Compliance Director for Evergreen Aviation Holdings. Oversight of all 6 regional carriers in our portfolio. Salary of $145,000 with full benefits and relocation assistance if needed. Direct reporting to me. Authority to build compliance infrastructure across all our operations, however you see fit. I thought about it. 12 seconds. Counted them in my head. What happens to Bradley? Franklin's voice didn't change. Mr. Ashworth's position is being reevaluated. His decisions at Ridgeline have cost this company substantially more than any savings he projected. The board is reviewing his performance across all areas of responsibility. Good enough for me. I'll need the offer in writing before I give you a formal answer. You'll have it by end of day. And Nathan, thank you for being willing to consider this. I know we don't deserve your help after what happened. You're right, you don't. But I care more about keeping aircraft safe than I do about proving a point. The offer arrived at 4:47 p.m. Everything Franklin had promised, plus a signing bonus that covered the income I'd lost during my unemployment period. Stock options, annual bonus potential, the full package. I signed it and returned it by 6 p.m. December 18th. I walked back into the Ridgeline offices as Regional Compliance Director for Evergreen Aviation Holding. Different badge, different title. Same systems I'd built over 11 years. First stop was Wallace's desk. He looked up when he saw me. Relief washed over his face like I'd just told him his house wasn't burning down after all. I'm going to need full access to everything. All systems, all documentation, all personnel involved in compliance activities. Thank God. He stood up and started gathering files. I've been trying to figure out your filing system for weeks. Every time I think I understand it, something else doesn't make sense. It's not complicated once you understand the logic. I'll walk you through it. But first, let's get those 12 aircraft back in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, I rebuilt what they'd broken. Reconstructed documentation for every grounded aircraft. Verified maintenance records against physical work orders. Updated the compliance tracking system. Fixed the email alerts. Met with FAA inspectors and walked them through our corrective action plan. Showed them exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how we were fixing it. The inspectors were professional, thorough, asked hard questions about how we'd prevent this from happening again. I gave them honest answers about organizational changes and new oversight structures. Didn't blame anyone by name, just explained what we were doing differently. By January 3rd, all 12 aircraft were back in service. The FAA downgraded us from enhanced surveillance to standard monitoring. Insurance premiums stabilized after I submitted a comprehensive compliance report demonstrating restored protocols. January 6th, my first day in the corporate office. Franklin introduced me at the all-hands meeting for Evergreen Leadership. Nathan Graves will be overseeing compliance across all Evergreen regional carriers. His expertise and institutional knowledge are exactly what this organization needs to maintain the highest safety standard. He has my full support and authority to implement whatever changes he deems necessary. After the meeting, one of the other regional directors found me in the hallway. Woman named Patricia, who ran the Montana operation. I heard what happened at Ridgeline. The whole story. The VP who fired you and then called begging for help? Bradley Ashworth. Right, she smiled. Word is he got transferred to our smallest operation in Wyoming. 40 employees. No direct reports. Paper-pushing administrative role. Basically a demotion disguised as a lateral move because firing him would have looked like admitting fault. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Also heard he has to submit weekly compliance reports to you now as part of the new corporate oversight structure. Is that true? It is. Patricia laughed. That's beautiful. The guy who called your work expensive fluff now has to report to the expensive fluff guy. I prefer the term essential operational infrastructure. But yes, January 15th, Wednesday morning. My email pinged with Bradley's first weekly compliance report. 3 pages of documentation that I'd specifically designed to require detailed knowledge of safety protocols. The kind of knowledge you only get from doing the actual work, from understanding why compliance matters instead of just seeing it as a cost center. His report was incomplete, missing 2 sections entirely, formatting errors throughout, incorrect regulatory citations, the kind of work that showed he still didn't understand what he was looking at. I sent it back with corrections needed highlighted in red, 27 items requiring revision before I could accept the submission. His response came back 4 hours later, fixed most of the issues but missed 3. I sent it back again, still incomplete. Please review FAA requirements for documentation format and resubmit. 3rd submission finally passed. Took him all day. The next week was the same, and the week after that. Every Wednesday, Bradley Ashworth submitted a compliance report to the man he'd called expensive fluff. February brought the quarterly safety review, all 6 Evergreen regional carriers. I presented the consolidated compliance metrics to the executive team. 0 FAA violations across the portfolio since I'd taken over. Insurance premiums trending downward. Documentation systems standardized across all carriers. Best compliance performance in company history. Franklin shook my hand afterward. This is exactly what I hoped you'd bring to the organization. March brought something even better. The FAA regional director reached out personally, said they'd been monitoring our turnaround, wanted to feature Ridgeline's recovery as a case study in their next compliance conference, a textbook example of how to rebuild safety culture after organizational failure. I agreed to present, figured it would be educational. The conference was in Denver. 200 aviation professionals in the audience, FAA officials, airline executives, compliance managers from carriers across the country. I walked through the whole situation, the cost-cutting decision, the elimination of dedicated compliance oversight, the 3-week collapse, the grounding, the recovery. Didn't name Bradley directly, didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what happens when you treat safety compliance as a line item to be cut. After my presentation, a guy from the FAA Enforcement Division found me in the hallway, said they'd been tracking similar patterns across the industry. Private equity acquisitions followed by compliance staff reductions, followed by regulatory problems. Said my presentation was going to become required viewing for new inspectors. April brought the annual insurance renewal. Our liability carrier ran the numbers on Ridgeline's recovery. Compliance metrics were now better than they'd been before the acquisition. Documentation systems were cleaner. Inspection pass rates were higher. They dropped our premiums by 14%. First time that had happened in the carrier's history for a company that had been under enhanced surveillance less than 6 months earlier. I forwarded the premium reduction notice to Franklin with a simple note. ROI on the expensive fluff, he wrote back. Point taken. Permanently. May brought Bradley's resignation. He'd been in Wyoming for 5 months, 40 employees, windowless office, weekly compliance reports that kept getting sent back for correction. The board had been documenting his performance issues since December, building a case. He quit before they could fire him. Sent a company-wide email about pursuing new opportunities. Nobody believed it. Eddie texted me the news. The expensive fluff outlasted the guy who tried to cut it. Beautiful, I texted back. Not beautiful, just math. Compliance costs less than catastrophe. Always has. He sent back a laughing emoji. You're no fun. Let me enjoy this. Fine. Enjoy it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and help us bring you more and better stories. Thanks.